So today we have Bob Lawson and Ben Powell to discuss their book, Socialism Sucks. Two economists drink their way through the unfree world. This is kind of Anthony Bourdain meets Milton Friedman, both a travel guide with the economics behind socialism. Bob is a professor of practice at Jerome and the Jerome M. Fullenwider Centennial Chair of Economic Freedom and is director of the O'Neill Center for Global Markets and Freedom at Southern Methodist University in the Cox School of Business. He's also the co-author of The Economic Freedom of the World. It's widely used measure of economic freedom of each country in the world, and kind of gives an indication of how free people are to engage in business. Very important index, covers over 150 countries. Ben Powell is director of the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University and professor of economics in the Rawls College of Business. He's a secretary-treasurer of the Southern Economic Association as well as the Association of Private Enterprise Education. If you're considering a PhD in economics, you might want to talk to Ben afterwards about opportunities at Texas Tech. They have a PhD program there. So, I think they're going to do a little tag team action here. You know, it's kind of like Ona Wiki and Bearcat Brown. You guys aren't old enough to know who they are, but it's the wrestling people. And when they're finished with their talk, they're going to take questions. Please use the microphones. There are going to be microphones on both sides here. We're recording this. And so we want to use the microphone so we know what the question is, so they're not just talking about some answer that we don't know what the question is. So anyhow, I'm going to keep this short and just let Ben and Bob take over here. So who's up first? Ben?
All right. Thank you, Steve. It's a real pleasure to be back here. I'm sorry that you had to bring Bob along, too, to make this possible. But looking forward to talking to you about this tonight. This is a project very different than, Bob has written scores, if not hundreds of articles that nobody reads. And we were trying to do a project that was a little bit different with this in reaching out to people who otherwise wouldn't read about economics. And Steve cleaned it up. The publisher's description actually was that the book was the bastard stepchild of Milton Friedman and Anthony Bourdain, which is exactly what we were going for. It's been a really fun project, and we've liked reaching these different audiences with it, and we'll talk with you all about it tonight. And one of the things there were kind of two things that motivated doing this project. One, Bob wanted to get drunk in Cuba, and he's like, "Hey Ben, let's go get drunk in Cuba." And my wife is, one, not a big fan of me taking vacations with Bob, and two, I wanted to write it off my taxes. So I'm like, hey, I've got an idea for a book project. If we write this up when we go down there, we can write it off our taxes, Cuban vacation 30% off. That was kind of the fun side of it. The other part was that this project started in 2016, so it was published, it came out this summer. And in 2016, we had just come off Bernie Sanders having a very compelling run in the Democratic primary, and then people like Michael Moore tweeting out at this time, most people polls showing that young people prefer socialism, which he calls fairness, to capitalism, which he calls selfishness. And to us, this is just, it doesn't fit. I mean, both of us teach at universities, we lecture at scores of places around the country, and I'm like, I don't think most young people are socialist. They might be identifying with that label, but there seems to be a whole lot of confusion about this topic. And we wanted to write a book that would help to clarify this a little bit for people and maybe reach some who wouldn't otherwise pay attention. So this is the tour of the world that we do. So we start off with not socialism in Sweden, starving socialism in Venezuela. Then we go to Cuba, North Korea, China, which we call fake socialism, hungover socialism in Russia and the Ukraine, the new capitalism that is in Georgia, and we end up back in the USSA by attending the largest socialist conference in the United States and talking to young people there. And starting off, let's just be clear about terms. Socialism means something. It meant something to Marx, it meant something to Lenin, it meant something to most socialists, and it's confused today. Socialism means abolishing private property in the major factors of production and replacing it with some form of collective ownership. In practice, for any large society, this means state ownership and/or control over the major factors of production. Now, you can have smaller kind of voluntary versions of this, whether it's the kibbutz in Israel of collective ownership, or, my own family, Bob, your family. It works something like from each according to his need, to each according, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. We have a central plan. Like, my kid doesn't go to the closet. I got a 10-year-old. He doesn't go to the closet and like bargain for his Cocoa Krispies with us. My wife, I was going to say my wife and I, but let's be honest, my wife, she basically centrally plans what's happening within the house. And that's a little island of socialism within a market, and that's fine. But on a large scale for a society, this means government ownership and or control of the means of production. Abolishing private property. So businesses are not privately owned anymore. And so some people will talk about this and say, well, it's like Sweden or the Nordic countries. There's a whole bunch of confusion about this. When the young people are saying that they prefer socialism, I'm pretty sure they don't mean ownership of the means of production by the government. And in fact, the confusion isn't just among young people. The New York Times, Bob, he was spared this part. This was research in the book. I had to read a year of these columns of the Red Century, they called it, on the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. And each week they had a column dedicated to the legacy of socialism. Out of 52 weeks, exactly one was dedicated to the economic stagnation caused by socialist systems, and maybe 5 or 6 dealt with the human atrocities. Instead, you got columns like why women had better sex under socialism, which, 1, I don't buy, and 2, even if true, how we weight this against like 100 million dead bodies. Not really sure perspective is there in the column. And then you have politicians like Bernie Sanders, who, when he's asked, how does socialists be elected in the United States? He says, well, I want countries like Denmark, like Sweden, like Norway. And I agree, those are nice places for the most part. They got some problems, but for the most part, nice places. Except they're not socialist. Volvo is a private company. Go to a restaurant in Sweden, it's privately owned. Go to a hotel, it's privately owned. Markets are the dominating force of how you allocate resources in the Nordic countries. Now, are they perfectly capitalist? No, but neither is the United States. Socialism and capitalism are not zeros and ones. There's a spectrum, and in fact, Bob, my co-author, has made his career, as Steve referenced in this, of working on the Economic Freedom of the World Index, which more or less is a way to measure how socialist end of the spectrum versus how capitalist end of a spectrum a country is. And in Sweden, turns out it's pretty capitalist. On that index, it's the 27th freest economy in the world. Now, how are they not capitalist? They have a big welfare state and they have high taxes. Are there consequences to that? Yep. At one point, Sweden was the fourth wealthiest nation in the world. Now they're in the bottom half of OECD countries. But it's not socialism that impoverished them. A big welfare state and high taxes dragged down their rate of economic growth, and other countries grew past them. As an economist, I think there's problems with that, but we shouldn't confuse these two. And by the way, the two economists drink their way through the Unfree World, by the way, it wasn't originally the title. It was two economists travel the Unfree World. The publishers kept sending us covers with actually kind of like Steve's posters for this event, with frothy beer mugs and stuff on. And one of them even had like a German beer girl in an outfit with two, and I'm like, you guys are, 1, it's not clear why there's beer on the cover, and I'm like, 2, you're missing the sucks part of the subtitle because these covers look pretty good to me. And so eventually they got the broken glasses and the spilling beer and stuff, and then I was like, well, we put the two economists drink their way through, because that's actually how we roll, but it also serves as a metaphor for how these economies function. And in Sweden, this is Bob and I drinking with our buddy Brad there, beer is great in Sweden. That's a Belgian beer bar, and Belgian beer is delicious. But it costs a hell of a lot in Sweden. In fact, we actually drank Belgian beer with Steve Goman on the other side of the planet in Korea at a cheaper price than what it cost us in Sweden when it's right around the corner from Belgium. High taxes and big welfare state have consequences, but it shouldn't be confused with socialism. Whereas what's going on in Venezuela today, Bob can tell you a little bit more about.
Okay, so we're tag teaming this. This is a little bit different than our normal talks where we have the tag team. And Ben talked for 15 or 20 minutes there, so I got to hurry up here. That's actually my way to tell him to hurry it up, right? So let's talk a little bit about the worst case right now. The worst case right now for socialism is Venezuela. The title of that chapter is Starving Socialism, and not entirely hyperbole, because the latest surveys, even from the government says the average Venezuelan has lost about 40 pounds in the last 2 or 3 years. So, and they're not all on Jenny Craig. Now, some of us would be happy to lose 30 or 40 pounds, but trust me, this was not by design. We actually went to the city of Cucuta, Colombia. It's a city, we flew to Bogota, then we flew to Cucuta. Cucuta is a major Colombian city right on the western Venezuelan border, the eastern Colombian border. And as we went around, there are these bridges. There's 2 sets of bridges. And literally every day, when we were there anyway, when we were there, tens of thousands of people every day are walking into Colombia because it's closed to vehicular traffic, so they have to walk. And they walk in and from Venezuela into Colombia to buy food, to buy groceries, to buy rice and beans. And one of the really interesting things, you can see the baggage, they're carrying luggage on the way in, and it's heavy on the way in. You could see when they were walking in with their bags, they had a backpack and usually 1 or 2 suitcases on rollers, like at an airport. And it was like, you could tell that it was heavy on the way in. It was kind of confusing at first. Why are the bags heavy on the way in to Colombia? Well, it turns out they're filled with Venezuelan currency. The Venezuelan currency, they've had hyperinflation. Last year's inflation rate was about 80,000% for the year. So the Venezuelan bolivar, when we were there, the highest note was 100 Bolivar note. Ben here is actually holding a stack of notes about that high, and that's about $8 that he's holding right there. So if you had $100, it would be more or less the size of a person. If you were going to imagine buying a car in Venezuela, you would need, a room full of cash. So they're bringing in cash. They bring in literally suitcases of Venezuelan currency, and they trade it for a tiny bit of Colombian pesos, and then they buy rice and beans and sugar and aspirin and deodorant and shampoo. We talked to one couple, and for all the travels we did, we had a lot of very important moments that are very memorable. But for me, the most memorable thing in all these trips was this couple, Paulo and Ana Maria. Paulo and Ana Maria were middle-class people. Paulo worked in a hotel. They lived in a city called Ciudad Bolivar, which is on the other side of Venezuela, almost on the Guyana Venezuelan side. So the other side, the eastern side of Venezuela. They'd driven 3 days, one way, 3 days, to get to Colombia. So it's a 6-day round trip to go to Kroger. I don't know what's 3 days from here. Vancouver? Vancouver's only 2 days. So you're driving from Louisville to Mexico City or something, and then driving back to go to buy rice and beans for your family. It is truly, without exaggeration, dystopic. And it was sad. And so we interviewed people on the trip. You can see on the Colombian side the wonderful entrepreneurs, the Colombian entrepreneurs who have set up shops to cater to the Venezuelans who are coming over. And one of the things, this couple right here, this is the young son and this fellow right here, they arrived, I remember when they arrived in a yellow taxi. Now, a yellow taxi is expensive in this part of the world. They were probably rich people, or at least upper middle class people. And so one of the things that really struck me is that this was not normal poverty. Now, normal poverty is something you should never get used to. You should never look at poor people in this planet and get used to that. It should always be jarring. And I've seen some of the world's greatest poverty in India and Africa, Indonesia. I have seen some of the world's greatest poverty, and it never should get comfortable. But this was not normal poverty. These were middle class, upper class people who are being reduced to a situation where they need to drive 2 or 3 days, 6 days round trip in the case of Paulo and Ana Maria, to buy groceries. So truly dystopic, really memorable experience. I think, Ben, we're going to let you take over in Cuba. Go.
You didn't tell them about the beer, though, dude.
All right. Beer became a metaphor. This is not a beer book. People think it's a beer book. Ben and I like to drink beer, but there is an element of beer to every chapter. In Venezuela, the government controls foreign exchange, dollars. And as you can imagine, they're running very short of dollars. and they need to import malted barley to make beer. So the Venezuelan beer company called Polar Empresas, the government didn't allocate enough dollars for them to import enough malted barley. So guess what? They have had periods of time where they couldn't manufacture beer. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was running a socialist economy, everything would go to hell because socialism sucks. But I would absolutely make sure we made beer. That would be the last thing we ran out of. In Venezuela, they've actually run out of beer. So.
There you go. All right. Beer and toilet paper. All right, so let's play a little game here. We're going to go to Cuba now, and y'all can participate in this. We're going to call it, it's going to be called The Price is Wrong. We're going to try to figure out, because this is government ownership of the means of production here in Cuba. And so Bob and I, we weren't sandbagging it. In fact, a friend recommended the first place to us. I'm not really sure how good a friend he is anymore. But it was a 3-star hotel in the suburbs. Government ownership of means of production means government owns or controls the hotels. So this is Hotel Trinton that you see here. And this is its picture from when it opened up in 1979. You can kind of see some of the decay. You can't really see all the broken glass that's the upper floors of it now. What you can see is where it's starting to say out of service in this picture here. There's 4 elevators for the entire building. 3 of them are out of service, which means Bob and I got to walk up 8 flights of stairs unair conditioned with our bags.
Dark, no lights.
Yeah, that's right. Dark, no lights, up 8 flights of stairs. And then we're greeted by, and this is actually a compilation of a couple pictures. The first one is the bathroom in Trinton, where it's missing a ceiling tile. You don't have the pictures of all the mold. But then we stayed later in the trip in Hotel Carib in central Havana, right near the seat of the government. And Bob totally screwed that one up. I blame this one on him. We had come from a long road journey back from Trinidad. We were hot, sweaty, miserable. We went to the first place that served beer. There was a hotel right next door. We didn't want to drag our bags anywhere. And I'm like, and he's like, well, there's a hotel next door. And I'm like, yeah, those hotels suck. He's like, well, I'll check it out. And I'm like, okay, but don't stay if it's as shitty as the first one. And he's like, okay. And I swear the air conditioning just tricked him. Because that was the glass that came out of the sanitized bag that you can see the stains in the glass. There's the hole in the towel. You can see the toilet. It's missing the bolt. So when you sit on the toilet seat, it's like whoosh. Slide off sometimes. And if you made a mess when you were sliding off, they conveniently left the previous guest's soap in the soap dish so that you could wash up. This is government ownership of the means of production in the hotels, and it sharply contrasts with Casa Particular. So a little over a decade ago, Cubans got the right to rent out their flats to tourists who are coming. And Bob and I reserved this one ahead of time, also in central Havana, which, by the way, reserving it ahead of time is a little bit of a challenge because, 1, your credit cards don't work in Cuba, and 2, the internet basically doesn't work in Cuba. But Cubans all have relatives in Miami, and you can reserve it through them, who then tell their relative to meet you there. And we stayed at this 2-bedroom place. You can see the kind of doors to the 2 bedrooms, a little kitchenette, a living room. It was nicely kept. There was a balcony out there. Want to guess, by the way, how much this hotel room cost? No, not $400. By the way, there is like a $400 hotel in Cuba. It's Hotel Nacional. It's where the diplomats stay. But it's like when the cosmonauts went into space from the Soviet Union. It doesn't tell you how their economy functions. This is about $60 a night. This? This was also about $60 a night. And we stayed, actually, this one is in Trinidad. That one was $25 a night on the south central coast. And in fact, it had a full-service bar underneath it, which is how we found it because we went there and started drinking. And the waitress noticed our bags and was like, hey, would you like a place to stay? And it had a big porch so I could smoke cigars after he passed out at night because he didn't hang as long as I did. Worked out really well. $25 a night. What's the difference? It's the same service, right? Accommodations. One of them is being provided by the state. One of them is being provided by private entrepreneurs who have a profit incentive, who reinvest their meager earnings into the capital to maintain the place because they have an incentive to attract customers. The other ones don't give a damn. Let's play what's wrong with these pictures. Top left picture. This is a commercial district in central Havana. What's missing? Okay. There's actually people there farther down the street.
Nothing in the store.
Nothing in the storefronts. There are some things in the storefronts, kinda. Can't see them from here. Signs. There's no signs. This is not because they're poor. Go to poorest countries in Africa or Asia. You will see signs. Whoever the local beer company is will give people signs for free. They can write stuff on it plus beer. There's no signs here. Why are there no signs? Because no one gives a damn. If you're a state-owned store, you don't matter. It doesn't matter whether people come in and buy your product or not. Bob and I would like wander around Havana and then would get thirsty and stop for a beer. But when you get to like a street corner and you look, is there beer down there? I don't know, Bob. Is there beer? I don't know. How do you find out? You walk down the street and you look in the store. Otherwise, you can't tell because there's no signs because no one cares. What's wrong with this store? This is a well-stocked convenience store. Bob and I could show you pictures of poorly stocked convenience stores. What's wrong with this one?
No variety.
What's this? That's, I called it Commie Cola. I don't remember its real name. That's their cola. There's one type. This whole store, there might be 18 to 24 distinct items in. There's absolutely no variety. When socialism
Don't stand by that.
promises equality, what they end up delivering on is sameness. This country has 2 beers. When Bernie Sanders says, why do we need 17 types of deodorant? People kind of nod their head like, I only use one type of deodorant. Do you only use one type of beer? Never mind that there's 16 other people who might have different preferences for deodorant. But the 2 types of beer, Bob, they're Bucanero and Cristal, right?
Yeah.
And one of them is about 4.5% alcohol, and one of them's about 5% alcohol. They both taste like a Budweiser that you left out in the sun a little bit too long. And this contrasts with the variety that capitalism gives us. This is a beer. That's literally its name. And in fact, it's a super American premium lager from Against the Grain Brewery here in Louisville, who has, gosh, at least a dozen types of beer that we had to choose from that one firm. And in fact, it says, if it's good, when it's time for a beer, you deserve the best. You deserve a super premium winner every time. You deserve a beer. And by the way, it's got like an America USA helmet on this person. It's really great. Product variety completely is lacking in Cuba. In fact, these are private restaurants that Bob and I are at the bottom. And at first, they seem okay, because just like the casa owners, they have an incentive to try. But the longer you're there, the more the same they feel. And they have commercial upgraded kitchens, and nice, but it turns out they all deal with the same state supply chain. So they've got about a dozen to 18 items on the menu. And Cuban food in Cuba is boring. A Cuban sandwich in Miami is delicious. It's a moldy ham and cheese if you have it in Havana. Even in the places who are trying, in fact, usually the trade-offs between price, quality of venue, and quality of food, you can get 2 of these 3 in your favor, but not all 3. It's not really true in Cuba, because you might as well, this is Bob sitting up on the balcony here, you might as well pick the balcony, because the food's about the same, the price is about the same. Yeah. Might as well have a nice view. And this is us as basically, let's be honest, like rich white people tourists. Normal Cubans don't eat this good. But even given our privileged access to it, it's still pretty boring. So Bob, you want to talk about cars and then talk about Cuba? I can talk about cars, but you can do it.
Yeah, sure. So
I got something I want to drink.
It's a bit of a cliche to talk about the cars in Cuba. When you first arrive, I'm an old car guy. I drive a 1968 Beetle. He's got an old Corvette. And so we're car guys. And when you first arrive, oh, cool, a 56 Plymouth, you know, an old Dodge. It was really neat. And then you realize, oh, yeah, the Detroit engine blew up 40 years ago, and it's got a Fiat engine now, and the suspension's gone, and don't even ask about air conditioning. But we started asking the fellows how much the prices are. Ben said the price is wrong. And one of the hallmarks of socialist economies is getting prices wrong, not getting prices right. And when prices are wrong, just like your decision-making gets weird. So there's an old American car, I'm not sure what kind, but there's a 1991 Renault there. There were some early 90s Peugeots and Renaults that apparently the government of Cuba had allowed to come in the early 90s. Now let's face it, a 1991 Renault was a piece of crap the day it was built, and it's 30 years old now, so it's really a bad car now. I don't think this car has any value in the US market. If you saw, in the worst part of Louisville, if you saw that car on a car lot, the dealer would probably give it to you, like just take it off the lot. You know, if you pay the taxes or the registration, you can have this car. This car is essentially worthless. Maybe it's a $500 beater car that you would buy for a high school student, if that. Anybody have a guess as to what that car costs in Cuba? $12,000. That's cute, no. That's a $30,000 US car in Cuba.
In a place where average incomes are roughly $3,000.
Yeah, so prices are really wrong. So it's not because of the US policy towards Cuba, which we're against. The US embargo on Cuba prevents us from us, but there's no reason why the Cubans can't import old used cars from Mexico or Brazil or from Europe. The Cuban government will not let cars come into the island. And because of that, it's just Econ 101, supply and demand. You reduce the supply of cars that much, you will raise the price. And that's exactly what happens. Even that American car there, which, I mean, in the American classic car market, that's a barn find. That's a $2,000 barn find. That car is about $18,000 in Cuba. So cars cost more than houses, which is absolutely absurd. And it's the kind of thing you get when the government is controlling the economy. In this case, they're controlling the car market. And you get absolutely bizarre prices. So it's a very strange situation. If a free market ever comes, if a free market ever comes to Cuba and you want to make $1, there's an amazing arbitrage opportunity, because you could buy a 10-year-old Toyota Corolla for what, $8,000 or something, and ship it there, and you can make a lot of money. So that's my advice for you entrepreneurs, is to buy low in Florida and sell high in Miami or in Cuba as soon as they allow it to happen. So let's move on to the darkest part of the trip, and that is North Korea. Now, we didn't go to North Korea. Our wives told us that we weren't allowed to get arrested or murdered.
Imprisoned.
Imprisoned. We weren't allowed to, actually arrest is normal. We weren't allowed to get imprisoned or killed. So we didn't actually go into North Korea, but we went to the northern North Korea border, the China-North Korea border, along the Yalu River. There's the Yalu River. It may be a 200-meter river. It's narrower than the Ohio River from what I could see. I'm from Cincinnati, by the way, so I know what the Ohio River looks like. And so we went there, and you can actually see North Korea, which you can't do from South Korea. The DMZ is wide enough that you really can't see North Korea from South Korea, but you can actually see North Korea from China. And you can see even guard towers. For whatever reason that I don't completely understand, the North Koreans paint their guard towers sort of a Smurf blue. It's a very strange paint there. But there's a city over there. But when we first arrived, many of you have seen this photograph from space. The Korean Peninsula, the south, of course, there's Seoul, but you can see all the lights from other major South Korean cities, filaments of lights along the highways, and then, of course, you see the darkness that is North Korea. You can see the capital of North Korea there, but otherwise, essentially no lights available that you can see from space. And this is not a Photoshop. So when we arrived in Dandong is the city. So we went to right here. This is the city that we were at. So that major light right there, that's the Chinese city that we went to, called Dandong. And when we arrived, the plane that we arrived on, it was dark when we arrived. It was a late night flight. And at night, we rushed down to the river because we were so excited. I mean, we're on the border of North Korea. Like, North Korea is right there. Let's go. So we went down to the river, and that's not a light. That's actually a full moon that night. So, but across the river, there's a few little pieces of light, but it's actually eerily dark on the other side of the river. And we were a little confused because our guidebook and all of our research had told us that there was a major North Korean city on the other side of the river. Some 600,000 or 800,000, 300,000 people. It was a major city. It's one of the largest cities in North Korea. And then so it's really dark at night. And then we went and took a photo. I think this is from Ben's room This is a hotel, and so this is the Chinese side. And the Chinese side is a modern, it's not Beijing or Shanghai by any means, but it's a modern sort of almost capitalist skyscrapers along the Chinese side of the river, lots of lights and advertising signs and so forth. But across the river, this up here where I'm pointing on the laser pointer, that's the North Korean side, that part over there. And there's nothing over there. But in the morning, you can see there's actually a major city over here. All those buildings over there, all of that over here, all the stuff that you see on the other side of the river, that's North Korea. And at night, it's completely dark. And so if you've seen that satellite photo, it's not a Photoshop. That's not some artist who's just some right-winger who, with Photoshop. That's actually a real thing. It was quite a shocking thing. Now, we didn't. We talked to one North Korean, and one of the problems is that North Koreans who do escape from North Korea into China, they're still illegal. And the Chinese citizens, people in China will get a reward for turning people in. So there's actually kind of an underground railroad now of people escaping from North Korea, but they can't just go to China. They got to get all the way out of China. Usually they'll go to Mongolia. If you get through China to Mongolia, you can get out. Once you're in Mongolia, the Mongolian government will let you fly wherever you want to go. So there are very few North Koreans around. But we did talk to one. She was, her parents were Chinese. So she was, but she grew up in North Korea, and she had just come over to China from North Korea. She grew up there. But she was, bless her heart, she was just terrified. I mean, Ben and I we're the only, I think we were the only white people, only Westerners we saw in the 3 to 4 days we were in Dandong. I mean, there were no Westerners. So, and she was just absolutely terrified, shaking almost, as we were trying to talk to her. And so at some point, I think I said, like, let's, because she was uncomfortable. She thought maybe we were spies. I don't know what she thought we were. But so it was very difficult to talk to North Koreans. But to continue with the beer story, we did buy some North Korean beer. So there's a bit of a smuggling operation across the river. People will bring North Korean items across, and Chinese tourists, just like us, would go there, and they were like, oh, look, North Korea, you want to buy some North Korean money, you can buy that. If you want to buy some handy words, baskets and stuff. But there was some beer, and so naturally, Ben and I, we bought some beer. And then not long after that, we drank, and it's one of the few beers I've never finished. I actually have never drunk industrial solvent, because I'm pretty sure that's bad for you. But I have an imagination, I have something in my head about what industrial solvent tastes like, and that's what this beer tastes like. It was truly the most toxic thing I've ever tasted. We had this beer with our friend Matt Kibbe, and we shared this beer. Was kind of a tall boy, so we shared it, and none of us could finish it. And after we did this, we went to dinner. Do you remember we went to dinner, Ben? And I think I had a Manhattan before my dinner. Then I had a steak, one of the nicest steakhouses in Dallas, Papa's Brothers, great steakhouse. And we had like side dishes of steak. And then I think we had a bottle of wine that we three of us shared. At least. And then I think I might have even had a cognac or something after. I mean, this was a very nice dinner. And I could still taste the North Korean beer. I was terribly worried that I was going to wake up and I said, if I can still have this North Korean beer in my mouth, if I can still taste it the next morning, I'm going to go to the hospital because it was truly that toxic. Now, if I was North Korean, I probably would drink that beer because every man needs a beer in his life. But B, maybe the beer would kill you before the government did. So that's North Korea. Let Ben talk about China.
You didn't tell them about who we met in in South Korea, though.
Oh yeah. Wait. Well, you can tell it. Tell that. You do that. Yeah. You make fun of Steve.
Steve makes a cameo appearance in the book because he was smoking cigars and drinking Belgian beer with us in South Korea. And some of his students today at lunch were surprised to what's the phrase that we used to describe him?
Bald raconteur of bad.
Raunchy jokes.
Raunchy
Cigar
jokes.
smoking buddy. Yeah, that's how he appears, and it's exactly how he is. You'll all have to find out for yourself. So China we call fake socialism because it's a communist political party that runs the country, but they've made so much reform over the last 40 years that it's now a crony capitalist economic system. It's not a socialist economic system. When you go, the signs are everywhere. There's signs that you know, it's Gap, it's Rolex, it's whatever Western brands that you're all familiar with. And markets are the main organizing force of Chinese society. Now, the state still has a big influence, particularly in finance and doing crony deals with its buddies. And Bob and I both think there's lots of problems with crony capitalism. But in contrast to Mao's China, which is great leap forward China, closest to pure collectivization that the world has seen, other than maybe during war communism under Lenin, it's a hell of a lot better, and it's growing fast. And here, Bob and his index, China is the biggest improver in the last 40 years in terms of economic freedom in Asia. But that's measuring at a national level. Most of what's happened at China is at the local or regional level, and there's lots of these free trade zones. This one is particularly striking. This is Shanghai. This is the old side of Shanghai, the 19th century trading city. This is the slum across the river in 1990. This is that picture in 2017 looking across the river at what was the slum. That's the iconic skyline now. Pudong, average incomes are now over $22,000 per person in what in 1990 was a slum. Economic freedom zone, boom, big growth. And what a lot of people miss on China, some of China's growth is fake. There's no doubt about it. But in terms of absolute poverty reduction in the world, it's like the greatest story in human history that's happening in China in sheer numbers. And a lot of it, by the way, is migration driven. The differences in productivity between internal landlocked zones in China and more economically free coastal zones are as big as between Latin America and the United States. Except people are basically free to move between these areas. They lose social services. But the productivity gains that they get are massive. And as a result, hundreds of millions are moving. A lot of Chinese economic growth has been migration driven. That's going to peter out over the next decade, probably about halfway through the mid-2020s. That part of Chinese growth is going to go away. It's not going to go away as in they're going to get poorer. It's just going to stop being at the levels that it has been in terms of gains. And it's differences in freedom that are driving that. That said, it's still a scary police state. And Bob and I experienced this firsthand. We spoke at a conference at the UofL Institute, which is a group that was founded in the 1990s and has pushed for marketization and reform in China. And while we were there, it was a conference on Ayn Rand and Austrian economics, like a mile from Tiananmen Square. We're like, this is cool. We're going to get, like, Ayn Rand's one of the great anti-communists of the 20th century, a Russian immigrant to the United States, writes Atlas Shrugged. And we discussed this with a bunch of Chinese professors and academics, maybe an audience half this size. And the next day, we get an email from one of our friends who had introduced us to some of those people. She said, I hope you haven't gone to the second day of the conference. Government thugs have been hired to beat up people entering the building. Building's chain closed. Founder, who's now in his 80s, is under house arrest. Now, I don't think it's something Bob said. But this is them having a dialogue about this during the Belt and Road Initiative in Beijing, and they get shut down. And they've really got, that's 2017 May. This summer, August, they got their permission to exist pulled from the Chinese government. So UofL, after 25 years in operation, is now closed. So while economic freedom's increased, discourse has still completely unfree there. Which you can talk about.
All right.
Russia, Ukraine, Georgia. Steve told us 10 minutes, by the way, dude.
Oh, cool. I got it. Don't want to talk a lot about Russia. We took in the book. We talk a lot about the Soviet Union. We talk about the war communism under Lenin, the new economic policy, Stalin, blah blah blah. The death counts are almost unimaginably large. But we went to Moscow. We went to Moscow for the first time. There's almost no evidence today that it's actually a former socialist country. For one thing, the beer is good. You can almost tell if you're in a socialist country, you're going to have very little beer, and it's going to be bad. If you're in a not socialist country, it's going to be good. The beer, the vodka was good. Everything was good in Russia. But one of the funny things about Russia was there were no lines, and that's also a hallmark of socialist countries. Socialist countries, especially the Soviet Union, were famous for lines, waiting lines. And that's because everything was in short supply, and the government central planners always set prices too low. And if you've taken economics, Econ 101, when you set prices too low, you get shortages. And when you get shortages, lines form. It's basic economics. The entire Soviet Union was basically a shortage economy with lines. And if you were in the old Soviet times, if you saw a line form, it didn't really matter. You would get into the line, then you'd ask, what are we waiting for? Because like, if there's a line, there must be something good. There's meat, there's butter, there's cheese, there's something that's worth waiting for. And there are no lines today in Moscow except for one. And there it is. That's the line, not ironically, I think, that's the line to get into Lenin's tomb. Lenin's tomb in Red Square, they don't charge for that, and so lines form. If you ever go to Moscow, don't waste your time. It's not worth the hour wait. But anyway, I thought that's actually appropriate. One of the few residual sort of memories, one of the few residual celebrations almost of the Soviet times is the line to get into Lenin's tomb. And they actually hope they never charge prices for Lenin's tomb. I hope they always have a line for it, because everyone in Russia should remember what it used to be like in Russia. But let's go on to the really cool story, and that's Georgia. I just got back from Georgia on Monday. This is my 16th trip to Georgia. I've been there many, many times. The title of this chapter is New Capitalism. Georgia was a Soviet republic, the Georgian SSR. In 1991, like all the Soviet republics, they split apart from Russia, from the Soviet Union, and they fought a couple wars for a couple years. Anyway, in 2004, they had a little revolution called the Rose Revolution in Georgia. And the Georgians decided that they were going to become a free market economy. In the Economic Freedom Index that I write, that I co-author, the Georgia in the last report was 12th. So in 1991, it was the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic, as far away from capitalism as you can almost imagine. And in the most recent Economic Freedom Report, they are ranked 12th. All right. It's been the biggest transformation from socialism to capitalism, I think, as any country in the world. Now, it's a tiny country. My city is larger than the country of Georgia. I live in Dallas, so a big city. But this is us. And to continue, I could go on for a very long time, but in the interest of time, I won't. I could tell you about all the reforms they did, the flat tax, the radical reductions. They fired, this is beautiful, they fired 35,000 police officers in one day in Georgia. And crime went down. Because the criminals were the cops. The cops were thieves. If you saw a cop, he was going to stop you, and the only way you were going to get away from him was to give him a bribe. They fired them all in one day. Beautiful, beautiful. We should try that here, I think. But to continue with the alcohol metaphor, this is not a beer country. This is a wine country. In Soviet times, the central planners in Moscow, they weren't idiots. They knew that Georgia, with its climate and its terrain and so forth, that Georgia and its history was the place to grow wine. So in Soviet times, the central planners in Moscow, they imported massive amounts of French grapes, Cabernets and such like that, and they planted thousands, tens of thousands of acres of French wines, and they made massive amounts of French-style wines, and they shipped it all through the Soviet Union. So Georgia in Soviet times was the wine-making part of the Soviet Union. All the wine came from Georgia. And it wasn't bad, but it wasn't good. It was Gallo. It was just wine, right? After the Soviet Union fell apart, guess what? No one wants to buy Georgian wine when you can buy French wine or California wine. So all those French grape vineyards, most of them failed after the Soviet Union broke apart. But the beautiful thing is, I think I just saw an article, there's 48 known local varieties of grape that don't exist, wine grapes that don't exist anywhere else in the world except for Georgia, 48 different varietals. And now what's happening in the last 10 or 15 years is entrepreneurs in Georgia have been bringing back those varietals. And they have a winemaking style. It's called a Quervy. It's a big clay pot. It's really crazy. It's very low-tech, nothing like the French or the modern style of making wine. If you've been to a modern vineyard, you see how high-tech it is? Georgians aren't high-tech. They crush the grapes, they throw it in a clay pot, they bury the pot, and then they wait. They pick up the pot, and you have wine. and the wines come out very, very different than the wines that we're used to. So if you're a wine snob, you should put Georgia on your radar. Go to Georgia and go to wine country, and you will taste some varietals of wine that just literally don't exist in the rest of the world. And the winemaking style is like a 1,000-year-old style. None of this modern stuff, no stainless steel tanks and everything else. So Georgian wine has become internationally renowned. And it's because of capitalism. It's because those entrepreneurs know that if they're going to get people to buy their wine, they can't just make millions and millions of gallons of crappy wine like they did in Soviet times. They've got to make a wine that's going to compete with the French and the California and the Chilean and the Australian wines. And they're doing that, and it's become one of the greatest stories in Georgia. So if you're a wine person, go to Georgia. We did go to Gori, the city of Gori, which is where Stalin was born. And yeah, I was not being nice when I saw the statue. Ben's going to finish up by talking about the Socialist Conference in Chicago.
And wine exports from Georgia to the United States up 50%. I saw in a Wall Street Journal article recently over the past year. So it's available now. So back in the USSA, we go to the Socialist Conference. And honestly, you know, Bob and I, when we were there, we heard lots of things young people were saying that we agreed with. They pointed out various injustices in the United States that we basically like, yeah, you know what, I kind of agree with. And it's a host of issues, whether it was immigration, Black Lives Matter, various cronyism issues, some environmental issues. We're like, they're bringing up legitimate points. Now, I don't think government owning the means of production would solve any of the problems that they're bringing up. But they're bringing up things that are real problems. And I think as free market economists, we need to do a better job of like recognizing legit problems we have here in the United States. And then talking about how can markets or how can civil society better address these rather than just being an apologist for the current American system, whatever it happens to be. That's a lot of the people that we talked to there really weren't interested in socialism. In fact, asking a lot of them, oh, so after you ask them why are they there and they tell you a bunch of stuff, so do you want to abolish private property? Oh, I don't think about that. That's the usual answer you got from most of them. But there was a big group within that that did want to. They were socialists and meant it. And for them, and this is the part the Venezuela chapter speaks to a little bit more, they said, I'm in favor of democratic socialism. Not Mao, not Stalin, not any of the existing socialism in the world, but it's going to be from the bottom up. It's going to be worker socialism. It's going to be democratic. Democratic's not a magic word that makes socialism not socialism. Socialism still means abolishing the private property and the major factors of production. And Venezuela is a case of democratic socialism where Chavez was democratically elected in '98, re-elected with a new constitution. But when you centralize control over the major factors of production, you're going to stagnate your economy, and people vote you out when you stagnate your economy. This is a well-known thing around the world. Except once you centralize control of the economy, you can punish dissent. And that's what you see happen in democratic socialist regimes. They cease to be democratic. So Maduro got reelected last year with over 66% of the vote. In a country that's losing weight, this does not pass the smell test. If you worked at state-owned firms, you were told to vote for them or you do not keep your job. They handed out food aid at polling places. The National Assembly appointed an interim president in January, which they're constitutionally allowed to do, and Maduro used the military to keep him out of office. That's democratic socialism becoming mere socialism. So of the young people we spoke to there, a lot of them I think had legitimate gripes, and we should talk about those but not confuse the answer with socialism. And a bunch of the others we need to talk to about, there's a connection between your political freedoms and your economic freedoms. You give away your economic freedoms, you're going to lose your political freedoms too. And democratic socialism is not going to be that much different than the real socialism that's been practiced around the world. And on the lighter alcohol note, this is Revolution IPA. It's a green fist with a red star on it because the very capitalist hotel understood their audience. It's the largest independently owned brewer in Illinois. And the irony is they produce a greater variety and quality of beer than all of the remaining socialist countries in the world combined. And I was quite happy to consume some of it there, despite the fact that they put commie logos on their stuff. Bob and I have been really happy with how this book is done. We made it to number 5 overall on Amazon, like 5 overall. Like there were just kiddie books in front of us. But I'm actually probably more happy with the fact that we made it to #1 for over a month in 2 categories. Communism and socialism, because some books are more equal than others. And,
That's funny.
and
I'm stealing
beer.
that. I'm sorry. That's great.
And beer, which wasn't like one of our goals, but it is like a life accomplishment. So with that, we'll conclude, and all of us will be happy to take questions from y'all.
Please use the microphone if you have questions. Use the microphone. Just go up and ask you.
Yes, sir.
I was in Cuba about 9 years ago and considered it a pretty dingy place, unfortunately. But had a lot of things going for it, great country in other ways. However, I remember raising certain things with them as far as the state of their economy, the standard of living, and they kept blaming the United States. They said, well, it's not our fault, it's the embargo. And you guys, talking about Americans and your allies, don't give us the opportunity to advance. So what's your response to that? Just curious.
Yeah, so actually in the book we talk about this explicitly. We think the U.S. embargo policy is a mistake for 2 reasons, really. One, because I think all embargo policies are a mistake almost. I mean, I think free trade makes people richer. I have no ill will to the Cubans. I want them to be richer, not poorer. But the real problem is it's given the Cuban government a rhetorical out that they have been able for now 50 years or more to use the U.S. policy towards them as an excuse for the failures of the socialist economy. You know, talk about the car market. It's not the U.S. embargo that prevents cars from coming into Cuba. It's not the U.S. embargo that stops, you know, I mean, there's only one country in the world. Now we're a major country, but they can trade freely with Mexico, Brazil, all of Europe, Canada. Their poverty is not because of the U.S. embargo, which I think is a failure. We shouldn't have that policy. But and we've let them get the sort of moral high ground because of our policy, and we explicitly say we're against it.
Yeah, and in terms of like the Cuban people, so you know, throughout Cuba you can see the posters where it's, you know, a big fist that says socialism punching Uncle Sam. But normal Cuban people are very favorable to Americans for the most part that we encountered. What's that?
Tell us about the kid.
Oh, the young student we met at the university I thought was actually way more insightful than U.S. policy when it comes to this and the blockade. Bob and I are walking up the stairs at the university. The kid's coming down and he says, oh, where are you from? Because I kind of stand out in Cuba and most of the other places that we've been. And I said Texas because that's what I always say, not because I'm like ashamed of the United States, but because if you say United States, they ask you about your president or politics. If you say Texas, they ask you about state guns and cowboys.
Cowboys.
I'm like totally way more willing to have that conversation. In any event, though, once he says United States, he's like, it's great when people from the United States come here because you bring us a little bit more. And Bob and I knew what his next word was going to be, you know, a little bit more money, right? Except, nah, that's not what he said. He said a little bit more freedom. That's what he said. And it was the idea of cultural exchange. And I think whether it's through tourism or through trade, the exchange of ideas that comes with that is important. And I think the embargo is a disaster if we want institutional change in Cuba. And I don't think trading freely with them would be a panacea, but I think it's a step in the right direction.
Thank you.
So, what are some examples of how free trade, a free economy can help ease some of the social problems you discussed?
This is your wheelhouse.
Yeah, I mean, so, the simple answer is that a free economy is massively more productive. I mean, all of the evidence, it's not even close. All of the evidence says that freer economies, using the Economic Freedom Index as our measure of freer economies, are vastly more productive. And you know, think about being more productive is it gives you more wherewithal to deal with social problems. If the problem is impure water. If you are more productive, you've got the resources to build sewers and water treatment plants and things like that. If the problem is some kind of disease, you've got the wherewithal, you've got the resources. So just actually having a more productive economy gives you the resources to deal with social problems. I mean, I know that it's kind of, a lot of people like to say, oh, GDP, 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 but the reality is GDP is just a word we use to talk about stuff that keeps us alive. And more stuff that keeps us alive, the better. So, and it's not even close. The evidence is overwhelming. That's the short answer, is that the evidence that we have, and it's not just evidence, it's the theory also, but the theory and evidence we have is that freer economies are more productive. Those freer economies have the resources to deal with social problems. There is essentially no social problem that I can find that is worse the freer the economy, except for one, and that's obesity. The only thing that I've ever found in terms of data that freer economies do worse on than less free economies is that freer economies have more obesity, and that's because you get rich and people eat more, and that's it. And obesity is a real problem, and I'm not making light of it, but that's the only, in terms of the statistics, in terms of the data, whether it's inequality, infant mortality, clean water, whatever the statistic you care about, the thing you care about, the freer the economy, the better that thing, except for obesity, which is a whole separate problem, probably. Yes, sir.
First of all, I just want to thank both of you for coming and hosting tonight's discussion. I really enjoyed it. I do have at least 2 brain cells, and therefore I know that socialism sucks. So I actually have a question about China. Crony capitalism, or as what you called fake socialism. So I'd like to preface this by saying that I don't believe that crony capitalism would ever upend the entire free market of American society. But recently we have seen the Chinese government subsidize with tax credits the creation of electric vehicles. They have 7 out of the 10 world's most polluted cities, and so it's pretty obvious that they want to sort of draw down some of that pollution. But the way it affects the American economy is for a firm like General Motors, they have essentially fled America entirely in pursuit of these sort of tax credits that are being artificially created by the Chinese. And like I said, I don't ever think it would upend the entire American economy, but how do we sort of fight crony capitalism with capitalism?
So that's an interesting twist you gave me at the end of that. My general answer on these things is we don't fight it. We trade freely with them and practice capitalism here. And if they subsidize the heck out of something in China, so be it. We get more products for free. And in fact, imagine that they subsidize it so much that they just sent us our stuff for free. We should welcome it with open arms, take their free stuff, and then make some other stuff to go with it, and we have free stuff plus our stuff. Now, is that bad for particular US competitors? Absolutely. Is it fair? No. But when we want fairness in a 50-yard dash, it's to find out who's fastest. When we want fairness in the economy, it's to figure out who can deliver the best products to everybody else. And if somebody subsidizes it so it's not fair, but we're getting products on the cheap, that's actually better for us because we're not going to permanently disemploy that labor or capital or reemploy it doing something else in the United States. And so in general, I think the way the United States should respond to Chinese, quote, unfair trade practices, let the stuff come in, and then we'll switch what we make here. Is that great for those who compete with it? Absolutely not. But is it on net wealthier for America? Yeah, that's the better way to deal with it.
Thank you.
Hello. So in regards to the youth support, at least in America, for socialism recently, do you think that stands out in recent history, and if so, why?
So there's one thing that is clearly different that does stand out is no American politician of a nationally competitive name or stature has ever, until very, very, very recently, been able to use the word socialism and get away with it. And that's a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, Bernie Sanders AOC. I mean, we have actually legitimate politicians who've gotten elected to major positions in the American government who are using the word socialism in a favorable way. And that is a bit of a departure. It's a bit of a line in the sand that we've crossed. You know, we've had socialists in America, you know, Eugene B. Debs, but you know, they were sideshows, they were jokes. Kind of like libertarians, they were jokes. So it's new. It's new that we've got politicians who are getting elected, at least in some constituencies. And that's what makes it a little bit more concerning than in the past. With that said, we talked about the kids. I mean, I didn't talk to a single person really at the Chicago conference who thought we should abolish private property. So I think that the word socialism is morphing to mean something else than what maybe Ben and I thought it meant, or what Karl Marx and everyone else who's used the word for the last 100 years. So now I think socialism is morphing into another word, and we need to get some clarity in that word. I do worry that people are going to call themselves socialists, and what they really mean is, well, we should have some more welfare or something, you know.
You know, related to that, I'm drinking out of a "Don't Hurt People and Don't Take Their Stuff" koozie that I found on Steve's shelf. That's a book by our friend Matt Kibbe, who did the postscript with us. Actually, we live drank the postscript to the book. But what he pointed out that I thought was really interesting, because he's a grassroots political guy. You know, it went from Youth for Ron Paul to Youth for Bernie Sanders from 2012 to 2016. And this is like as polar opposite policy positions as you can get, except for the anti-war part maybe. But in terms of their rhetoric, they're raging against the machine and the crony insider game in DC. And I think that's a lot of what it is with the younger people on this. Is they see injustice, they see an insider game, and they like the rhetoric against it, but haven't thought through the policy proposals about how to deal with it. Because otherwise, it's really hard to square the young people from Ron Paul to go into young people for Bernie Sanders.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I have like two questions, sir. My first one is, okay.
Pick your best.
So you mentioned like Venezuela economy, like how it's like going downhill. Do you think like later in the future they'll ever make a comeback or like be at least stable? Like, do you think?
Do you want us to take all three of these questions and then do them? What's your thinking? Yeah. I have no idea. It really depends on what the political equilibrium is in Venezuela, and as economists, we're not particularly advantaged in figuring that out. I mean, the gains are there, but it's about getting the ideas right there, and I'm not.
Something that can't go on forever won't, but whether what comes after this nightmare is you know, good or bad, I mean, I don't know. It could go Myanmar bad, or it could go like maybe Mexico good, which, you know, those aren't great, but, you know, who knows?
Thank you.
Sorry.
Hi, I really love what you guys are doing, spreading these ideas, but I guess my biggest question is, what was your biggest like career decision that led you guys to be able to like travel the world and talk about these ideas? Because I just love it.
Well, you know, so I'm going to answer. So,
Then I'll tell the truth afterwards.
well, here's the reality of it. This, you know, we're both fairly senior professors. I run a center at SMU. He's a little less senior, so he doesn't like me saying he's senior yet. But we both run centers at major universities. We've published a lot of articles between us. I think maybe 200 articles between us and books and things. We have reputations. But the reason we wrote the book is because, frankly, no one reads our stuff. So we thought, well, but you know, but if I was a 25-year-old assistant professor at the University of Louisville, writing this book would be toxic to my career, because for two reasons. One is it means I didn't write the articles I need to write to get tenure, but also because this is, you know, you write a book called Socialism Sucks, you better have a position in your university and in the profession that is stable, and we both have that. So it really took us 20 or 30 years, 30 for me, 20 for him, to get to the stature where we were safe enough to write a popular book for a lay audience with a title like this. You know, but again, the difference is that we're academics, and I think it brought to the book, first of all, there's levity in the book. You can see that in our presentation. There's levity, but we were able to tackle, a literally deadly serious topic. And the reason we were able to tackle it was because we're professors. We have the analytical background to handle a serious topic like socialism while also having fun with it. And it took us 20, 30 years in our careers to get to that point.
That was cute.
Yeah.
I got drunk, on the way on a flight into
it's,
Turkey, and I emailed them like, hey, I got a book idea, dude.
It's all a tax dodge.
All right, so this might be a little bit off topic, but I have to ask, have you two ever thought about going on The Amazing Race? Because I think you'd be a phenomenal team, with your travel experience.
Sign me up, brother. I used to run a lot of ultra marathons, so I could probably do it. I don't know if you can keep up, though.